Very good. Thank you very much. So now we have a chance for those present here. Yes, Professor Mogacci.
I wonder, I have 3 points, and I wonder if you can comment on a couple of them or all of them. You alluded to 1685, 1686. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more, because many people in the outside world who are not familiar with Orthodoxy think what's going on is something new or something radical. And in many ways, are we not just witnessing here a return to what the situation was before 1686? In that sense, we have a continuity. And that didn't figure much, and I've glanced at your book, and I'm not certain how much it figures in there, but what actually happened in 1686? Was this truly just the Ottoman Sultan putting pressure on the ecumenical patriarchate so that he would have better political relations at that time with Muscovy? The other thing I'm curious about is there's been discussion in this room not too long ago from the people who don't understand the church, view all of this in political terms. The argument being is that one president of Ukraine, or two presidents of Ukraine, failed to, bring autocephaly to Ukraine, but now Poroshenko has been successful. And when you counter that with the argument that these are church matters, they just look at you as if there's something wrong. And this, of course, then raises the whole question of the motivation of the ecumenical patriarch. I mean, what we're speculating here, but why now? You did allude a little bit to that, implying that, well, maybe it was the political situation, maybe it was, in fact, the demands of secular presidents that pushed him in the direction to act now. Then one can also ask the question, as was alluded here, why didn't he act? Why isn't he still acting on Macedonia, which has been sitting around since the late 1950s? Why take on the Russian Orthodox Church now and not having taken on the Serbian Orthodox Church before? And is this perhaps then a model for maybe they are going to turn and respond to or resolve Macedonia and resolve Montenegro as well? This is the other one out there. Or is it just simply that the ecumenical patriarch is getting old, about to retire, and he wanted to expose a few issues here before he moves on to the other way?
Thank you for those observations and questions. I did not say much about 1685, 1686 in my book, and it's one of those things where I feel like there's a thorn in my flesh, because in the intra-church discussion, it's dominating everything. We're back in the 17th century. And there, in fact, if you follow at all Catholic battles, the great Catholic battle of the 20th century, in terms of at least after Vatican II, was a series of letters exchanged between Walter Kasper and Joseph Ratzinger on what is the church, local or universal. Now, in the sphere of social media, there's a battle about the ecumenical patriarchate and its authority taking place between Konstantin Vatochnikov and Mikhail Zheltov. Zheltov has published a very detailed article which he claims demonstrates that the ecumenical patriarchate always consistently acted canonically to have one metropolitan of Kiev, in a metropolitanate that migrated from Kiev to Moscow for obvious reasons. And that was always his impetus, and so the 1686 decision was a finalization, a realization of having one metropolitanate that would unite all of Rus. Whereas the ecumenical patriarchate published the documents, translated them, and made it very clear that this was the right to ordain the Metropolitan of Kiev because of the conditions of that time, but was not supposed to be a complete transfer of jurisdiction. And I think the question comes about, and it's a fair one, and it's one that we would hope to hear more in academic and in church settings from the ecumenical patriarchate, why are we returning to the 17th century in 2018? Because one thing I think isn't very clear, and I would actually think that there's a minority of us who think this, from the ecumenical patriarchate's perspective, and I kind of wish there was someone here who could speak on their behalf, there is no Kievan patriarchate anymore. There is no Autocephalous church. Everyone in Ukraine is under their canonical jurisdiction. They have essentially rebooted the Kievan metropolia of the 17th century by reclaiming that canonical authority. And that is the canonical path, the argument. This is the only way that they can take this action and the only justification for instructing Metropolitan Onufri that once the election takes place, you no longer have the right to bear that title. So from their perspective, there is a Kievan metropolia, and everyone is under their jurisdiction now. And I've heard bits and pieces that some churches in Kiev are commemorating him liturgically. And that would be a ritualization of this canonical authority. And I think when when Filaret and the Synod decreed that his official title in intra-Orthodox relations is now Archbishop of Kiev and Metropolitan of all Rus in Ukraine, that this was a nod to the canonical presence and the reestablishment of the Stavropegion of Constantinople in Ukraine. And my understanding is that they're going to have a handful of churches where they will retain a presence in Ukraine. And I personally think that that's wise, because this post-December 15th period is going to be tumultuous. There's no getting around it. So I don't know if people have a sense that, my understanding is that in Ukraine people are saying, well, what's a tomos? We've never heard of this before, and it's people in, you're buying pirashke and you're talking about a tomos and autocephaly. So, that's a very difficult issue. Now, about the state issue, I think that's very important. I think it's very embedded into those of us who are in the West, maybe not all of us, that we just take for granted of separation of church and state. And if you think about, just imagine for a minute, let's leave Ukraine for a minute and go to Moscow. The conditions of the Moscow Council of 1917-18, a council which was funded by the Kerensky government. And you have already trying to adjust to this change and unable to, under severe pressure to draft a document that will be part of the statute of how they're going to relate to the state. There's actually fascinating scholarship in Ukraine. Who do we commemorate at the Great Litany? Do we commemorate the Hetmany, Skoropadsky? Do we commemorate, and there's a debate amongst Litkivsky and his cohorts in the 1921 council, do we commemorate the Soviet authorities? And they have to come up with a theological justification for this. So we see this attempt to adjust to the state. And whatever one makes of the church historian Vlasovsky, and one of the things that I thought was very helpful is he does address this matter of state and church when he is attempting to justify the directory's establishment of a law of establishing a canonical autocephalous church. And he basically says, well, this is all they've ever known, is everything always occurs in conjunction with the state. And that's why I mentioned Bishop Boris's article of the elevation of the patriarchate, because I think it's very important to have a sense of just how powerful of a role the Russian aristocracy and the Tsar and the entire imperial court played in playing political games with the Constantinopolitan delegation during the process of elevating Moscow from a metropolia to a patriarchate. And so what I think that we're seeing today is in the post-Soviet period, you simply cannot disentangle state interests from the church. It's not possible. We want to, and we want to impose our values upon them, but the state, anytime the church is creating political problems in the state is going to make a statement. We talked about Yushchenko, Poroshenko, Yanukovych basically agreed to a stational liturgy in 2013 that went through Kyiv, Moscow, and Minsk to demonstrate the unity of the three coronations of the Ruski Mir. And in each instance, the presidents of the country met with the bishops. And the Ukrainians love to post pictures of Putin giving an award to all of the different metropolitans in the Ukrainian church under Moscow. But I think that this is the reality that they're dealing with. The other reality is, well, what about the two statements made by the United States State Department? Or Erdogan's role in all of this? And those are realities that we have to honor and confess. I think there's a great deal of positioning happening here. And with the ecumenical patriarchate, they're being deliberately pithy and terse in what they're willing to say about their motivations. I mean, what has he said publicly? Ukraine deserves it, and we're using the Balkan pattern for autocephaly. And it's generating a lot of interesting discussion among Orthodox theologians. I'm speculating here, but I think that there's been a crack in the relations between Constantinople and Moscow for decades, and that Crete widened that gap enough where the ecumenical patriarchate is trying to reassert their definition of primacy in the Orthodox world, and the nervous responses of the other churches, to me, in my estimation, shows that we do not have a consensus within the church on what primacy is.
Dr. Tataryn, I just one quick comment and a bit more about the. When I read the Kievan Patriarchate statement on titles, I thought, "Welcome to the Greco-Catholic world." I think your last point about the ecumenical patriarchy, I think that the past, I will say, 50 years need to be looked at in terms of how Constantinople has related to Moscow. Because regardless of what happened before, I mean, let's remember that at Vatican II, the Moscow trumped Constantinople. Because there were ongoing discussions about having a delegation from Constantinople to come to Vatican II as observers. And at the last minute, Moscow said, if you do that, you're in trouble. Constantinople pulled out, Moscow went. In that whole period of the past 50 years, Moscow has tried continually to position itself as the preeminent see within Orthodoxy. They invited Constantinople to move to Switzerland, right? Because they would have a better position there than Turkey. Why? So they couldn't claim to be the Church of Constantinople anymore. So I agree. That relationship has to be looked at, because that's an important part of what's been happening, I think, in terms of Ukraine over the past few years. Immensely huge. And I think you're right. Great and Holy Council was the last straw, I think, for Constantinople.
And Havana.
Yeah, and Havana. Oh, yeah, Havana.
And then you have also the International Orthodox Dialogue, where the Russian delegation walked out of the discussions and refused to sign the declaration on primacy within the church.
Yeah.
So, question here. Okay. You want to arm wrestle?
Okay, so I'll then make it short. Of course, I've been able to read the book, and one thing that strikes me of our discussion so far that perhaps has not been dealt with in the fullness it should be is the language issue and the Ukrainian language issue. I think Professor Tataryn brings this up. In Canada, it's very easy. You stop using Ukrainian, you can use English, fine. You want to use any indigenous language, go on. The Ukrainian language issue, I think the centrality of it, particularly when you discuss 1918, perhaps we pay too much attention to autocephaly and the independence, and not enough to the introduction of Ukrainian in the use of the church, and above all of the liturgy. And then at a certain time, we forget how many people in Ukraine will tell you, I don't want to go to churches that are in Russian. And then you have to tell them, but the church you go to isn't in Russian. That church you go to is in Church Slavonic. And this is much more than just, it's on the one hand, the territorial church and the Ukraine issue is an issue of reality in Ukraine, a country in which half the population, 40%, are speaking Russian on a basis. But it's a much broader Orthodox Slavic world problem. The Ukrainians will break ranks. And if they break ranks, then what are the others to do? I mean, it even might cause some of the Greeks to want to have a liturgy that they could understand, or the Armenians to give up Grabar. But above all, in the Slavic world, this issue is, I think, come back. So maybe you could amplify a little bit more what you have to say about where the language issue fits in this discussion.
I want to say something about the Greeks first, because they have a synodal committee for liturgical renewal, and they've issued, I think, 12 or 15 documents or something like that. And one of them was to introduce the reading of the Gospel and the Epistle in modern Greek after they do it in the older version of Greek at the liturgy. And it was introduced by the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Christodoulos of blessed memory, in Athens, and the people asked him to stop doing that because they didn't want modern Greek to be used. And so a colleague of mine and Father Daniel's in the liturgical field, Father Alexopoulos, says, we modernize and we embrace liturgical renewal very slowly and very carefully, unless you're Ukrainian Orthodox, in which case I cannot emphasize, I think, Metropolitan Evlogi was a great source in his memoirs on his recollection of the 1918 Council. And he says the movement for autocephaly was relentless, and it was a real struggle. But he also expresses a sense of triumph in the defeat of the proposal for using Ukrainian in the liturgy. And that really was, if you think about it, when they registered those parishes and they started the soft subversion, this was so that they could have Ukrainian language liturgies. They basically used the strategy of, let's do it first and then ask for forgiveness instead of asking the bishop for a blessing. So you have a registered parish with hundreds of people joining for a Ukrainian language liturgy, and the bishop is saying, no, we have to use Slavonic, but we're not quite sure what we're going to do with this. And there was criticism, we were talking about this before tonight, of the haste with which the 1921 Council translated the services. Ivano Hianko, then later Metropolitan Ilarion, was very critical of the translations. They used their own translations in the church in Poland. There were several eruptions of Slavonic versus Ukrainian being used in Poland. But what I find most interesting is that of all of the things that have remained stable in the post-Soviet period, it's that the Kievan Patriarchate and the Autocephalists use Ukrainian. And they're committed to Ukrainization. And what I think is fascinating is that in the Moscow Patriarchate, there are a number of translations of the liturgy into Ukrainian. And you go into some of their churches, and you'll say, oh, you're going to celebrate Ukrainian today. And they say, yes, we use the Kievan Patriarchate translation. And which is kind of funny because I thought it was uncanonical, but I guess it's canonical enough to use for the liturgy today. All of that being said, after the Maidan, at the Kievan Eparchial Assembly in December 2015, some priests raised the question of, can we use Ukrainian? Can we talk about translating the liturgy, about embarking upon this? And Metropolitan Onufri said, well, there are these precedents, but Slavonic is a superior language of prayer. Ukrainian is not a sophisticated enough language to be prayed in. You can read the gospel, and they do on the Lavra on Pascha. They read the gospel in Ukrainian. And that was provoked a 4-part essay on the history of translation in the Orthodox churches by Metropolitan Alexander Drabinko that was published on some online. I think it was Religia v Ukrainie. And I think that issue, people ask me, and they probably ask you and a lot of you here, what's the difference in Ukraine between Moscow Patriarchate and Kievan Patriarchate? Liturgy, language. language is the primary difference. And I think that the fact that Ukrainization has proved resilient among these churches that didn't simply go away or didn't become reabsorbed into the so-called Canonical Church is a testimony to a commitment of one facet of modernization that you won't find as vibrant. I mean, I know some Russians who want to use vernacular Russian in the liturgy and use it, but I don't know if that. I don't think that discussion on replacing Slavonic with Russian in this time is anything like it was in the pre-conciliar period before the Moscow Council, when they actually had proposals on the table and they didn't take them up because Patriarch Tikhon wanted to reconcile with the old believers. And so in the Ukrainian sense, it became a politicized issue of division. And, I would hope that whatever happens on Saturday, that if there happened to be a great migration of Moscow patriarchal parishes to the new church in Ukraine, because that's possible, maybe not bishops, but there could be parishes. If they pray in Slavonic, why not have both languages be the official liturgical language of the church for the time being, and give it some time and work on a common translation for all? Instead of forcing Ukrainization has also been problematic in the history of the church.
So you can see how this is, the Synod should listen to what we're saying this evening to be directive for what they should decide on Saturday. I think there was a question here. Was it Marta or Anatoly? Yeah.
So I want to mention again the ecumenical aspect. During the last decade, we understood that, on the Catholic side, we have a question of primacy of role. And from the Catholic perspective, on the Orthodox side, we have a question of the Autocephaly. And the Catholic side also always asking, what do we mean by that phrase, by that word, Autocephaly? As we see today in Ukraine, that Metropolitan Patriarch Filaret wants to receive an autocephaly in terms of Russian Orthodox Church. So give us this autocephaly and buy. We don't need it. It's understanding of autocephaly, I think, in terms of Duce Mussolini. Everything is within the state, nothing is against the state, and nothing is outside the state. So this is the total autocephaly without any, sorry. Jakich wtrącań.
Interference.
Yeah. So, as I understood that from the Constantinople perspective, it looks quite different. That autocephaly cannot be total. So, can we see that we are now experiencing that Constantinople wants to redefine the very notion of the autocephaly?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think that part of what's happening on the part of Constantinople was that in the 20th century there was a sense of wanting to restore synodality, conciliarity, and so before the debacle in Crete and the withdrawal of 4 churches from participating in the council in Crete, you had these synaxes of the heads of the Orthodox churches. And so for a while there was an appearance that there will be a new era of cooperation despite the tensions within, and the greatest tension was on the method of declaring autocephaly. And it's Shishkov who has a very good article on this recently on which Orthodox stand where and support the 3 different methods. One would be pan-Orthodox consensus, one would be from Constantinople, has the sole prerogative, and the other would be from the so-called Mother Church. And I think that what Constantinople is doing is asserting their authority as the first among equals, which some call the first without equals. And you see that phrase used in Latin in both definitions in response to the implicit accusation that Moscow has attempted to be the ecumenical patriarchate by the use of that power. Now, I think the larger question that you're asking is what kind of interdependence is there then among the Orthodox? There was a great deal of anxiety in the Ukrainian media and among certain Ukrainian Orthodox people when a draft of the statute supposedly was leaked online that said that the Ukrainian Church has autocephaly through the ecumenical patriarchate, and that the question of whether or not all appeals would go to, well, they already regard themselves as having the canonical authority to hear appeals. And it is also the Constantinopolitan tradition to give myrrh for the mystery of chrismation to all of the churches. It's a patriarchal thing. And in that sense, I think that you simply have different definitions of what autocephaly is. Because, for example, at the 1917 Moscow Council, even though the Ukrainian Church was autonomous, the Moscow Council granted them the authority to consecrate their own myrrh. And yet, an autocephalous church in the Constantinopolitan definition receives their myrrh from Constantinople as a mother church. So there really are differing definitions of autocephaly. How those play out in theory as opposed to practice, to me, I think that you would have to avoid reading that very strictly. I also would welcome, a dialogue between Catholics and Orthodox on what the Orthodox mean by primacy. And the Orthodox have been trying to do that, at least in the academic level, because Father John Krzyzewski published 2 volumes of reflections on primacy in the Church, which go from reflections on the primacy of Peter to really putting into contradistinction with another the Constantinopolitan and the Moscow positions. And that's why we have theory and practice, because in practice now we're seeing this erupting in conflict. What the Ukrainians are going to have to ask of themselves is, since they decided to turn to an external authority to resolve this issue, is what will they owe Constantinople? When an intra-Orthodox issue comes into play, and you can bet it will happen soon, will Constantinople ask the Ukrainians to pay their debt? I think you can count on that happening sooner rather than later, to be honest.
I think we had by the poll there, and then we're to the left. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for the 2 presentations. I was kind of surprised that there was so much discussion of liturgy and the 17th century, although I'm pleasantly surprised. It seems that the big issue in the 20th century was liturgical language, but nevertheless you mentioned in the 17th century there was opposition to Russification of liturgical practices in Kiev. Can you just summarize from your book, was there an attempt to revive something that was authentically Ukrainian or Kievan in the 20th century, or were people more forward-looking? Because I know there were ideas of some kind of renewal or language, but was there any attempt to revive something that was supposedly lost?
I think that this is a wonderful area for more research. So the 1921 Council, if you're like we are and you really love liturgy and its history, it has all of these sessions on not only language was one part of a larger Ukrainization program. And part of that was the complaint that the method of composing liturgical music that had flourished in Ukraine was annulled by the Synod. And you might remember I asked you if you knew specifically of that synodal decision when it happened that annulled or made illegal the use of I think it's that the hymnals. Yes, the Bohosnike. Because as we know, that was something that went from Central Europe all the way to St. Petersburg, but it was a primarily 17th, 18th century phenomenon. And I think the other issue was that if you look at Ohienko's work, he played liturgist for a while. And even in the Ukrainian Church in Canada, he restored some things that were in specific liturgical books. In the Sacrament of Marriage, that he put the vows back. And he also reflected upon certain methods of receiving communion that he claimed were authentically Ukrainian. And then I think the big one, though, is that some people wanted to use and recreate elements from the Mohyla Trebnik. And those elements had disappeared. And it was Heather Coleman's research where she has the letter of a Ukrainian priest, or the memoirs, a biography written, who is complaining that we used to have our own Trebnik. And, I'm saying Moscow, but the word that they use is synodal. So Philip Chozitsky, who was the leader, one of the musical leaders of St. Sophia Cathedral in the era of 1921, along with Kirill Stetsenko, called for the creation of a Ukrainian national capella that, in the words of Stetsenko, would be like the Moscow Synodal Choir, with a distinctly Ukrainian method of drawing upon folk melodies to compose liturgical music. And as some of us know, that liturgical music flourished incredibly for a very short period of time. But you can still hear it. In fact, I think it was Chozitsky who said that that liturgical music was the great renaissance of the time, and you can locate it in the Panichida of Stetsenko's Panichida. And if you listen to it, I'm not an expert in the musical, in the process of composition that he used, and in Prelovska's bibliographies, she has some articles and books that were written on Stetsenko's methods of composition, but it sounds to me like he used folk motifs in composing a Panichida, because if you just sing the melody line, they sound like they could be folk motifs. And I think that that's an important kind of attempt to reclaim that new cultural context, that new cultural paradigm that you mentioned in your response that was very vibrant in 1921. And one of the questions that I have today is, for the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, is it going to be a copy of the pre-revolutionary Church of Kyiv? Or will you see some kind of engagement with contemporary culture in all of these respects? So, I think those are important questions. There's a great deal of work to be done in the liturgical area. There are also things done that were very creative liturgical performances of dramas composed by Chekhyvsky in Sofiyski Sobor, which are pure liberation theology. They have sensings, and your dad wrote about some of those. And they're waiting to be translated and published. They're just fascinating liturgical creations.
Okay, we have a question over here.
As an outsider, I was struck by the gentleman in the glasses comment about using Ukrainian for the liturgy, because I'd almost say they sound like Protestants. Because to me, that's what Protestantism 500 years ago was about, using the vernacular, being understood by the members of the church, and doing everything in German or French or English, with the extra aspect that in Western Europe, when you disagreed with someone, you killed them, right? But I mean, you're fundamentally Protestant, but there's, Protestants really didn't care, what the Pope had to say, so they, traded insults and killed each other. So why aren't you just Protestants, of the East, and forget about all the rest, and use Ukrainian, and wonder why, when Stalin was in power, while he was killing all these millions of Ukrainians, why he didn't liquidate whichever church wasn't collaborating. Hit the Russian Orthodox, or his puppets. So how is it, while he's killing all these millions of other Ukrainians, he didn't wipe out all the opposition to, his dictatorship? So there's two aspects, a Protestant sort of aspect, and why, these tyrants, weren't just killing the people they disagree with, because that's the,
Okay, so the
question.
response. Do you have a comment, response, or either one?
I have a comment on the, briefly. So, all right. Natalia Shlichta's answered the question of liquidation under Stalin, because that's the Lviv Synod of 1946. And to be honest with you, I think from an academic perspective, that has to be examined through post-colonial theory. This is Spivak's idea of there being an ideal Soviet citizen, and the only legitimate church, and I'm disentangling for convenience right now the suffering of the Russian church under Stalin. I'm not going to impose my conditions upon the actions that they took because it's just not historically fair. But what I want to say is that this was an attempt to make them into ideal Soviet citizens, where the one legitimate church was the Moscow Patriarchate. And so that question has been answered. Why not create a citizen who's almost like the imperial colonialist? And that's Baba now. That's Homi Baba, not Spivak, but not quite. And the way that they handled that was by mild Ukrainization, and that's in Botsirkiv's scholarship, where he says, here, you can finally have a Ukrainian metropolitan, Filaret Denysenko, and you can also have a periodical in Ukrainian, Pravoslavny Vysnik, the Orthodox Herald, which typically before that had been in Russian. Now, the liturgical language, this is what the Ukrainians did, was they essentially continued the work of the pre-conciliar commission in preparation for the Moscow Council. I think it was a surprise to everyone that vernacular translations weren't authorized by that council. Because if you read the work in Nikolai Balashev's very detailed volume on liturgical renewal in Russia on the eve of the council, it makes it very clear that there were several proposals for the translation of the liturgy into both Russian and Ukrainian, and proposals including part Russian, just the hymnography, just the gospel, and the epistle. And it was the political situation of the time that turned the tide. And if you look at that through the lens of the vacuum of history, there's a couple of events where, in trying to claim Ukraine as a free country in 1918, there was a forceful commemoration of Ivan Mazepa, where the sermon that was offered was extremely polemical, and the Russian bishops in Ukraine were forced to participate in that. And I think that what you see there is where this sort of, we're going to claim our own identity and we're going to use our own language, creates conflict. The one thing that you cannot reproduce in 2018 is the speed with which people had to make decisions. It's not like they could say, well, we're going to talk about this for 2 years. They had to respond to these requests immediately when tensions were inflamed. And the 1918 All-Ukrainian Council was doomed from the beginning because as soon as that council started, the Metropolitan of Kyiv was murdered. And that only made that set the context for that council, which was already dubious because the Metropolitan himself didn't want it. The Patriarch overruled him. It simply set a very negative tone for the context of the rest of the council. And if you look at the history, I can't imagine how they even had the sessions that they had, because the rulers kept changing all throughout the course of the council. It's very hard for me to grasp that.
I think I saw a hand somewhere over here. Was there another question? I know we've reached the time here, but if we could probably take one more question. Yes.
Just help Ukrainian Orthodox recognize themselves. I guess someone, they say the Ukrainian Orthodox haven't heard someone identify as a part of Autocephaly or a part of the Kievan Patriarchy or the Moscow Patriarchy. Is that something that happens at a lower level? Or we've talked about before, how would the Ukrainian Orthodox unite? I'm just wondering how in Ukraine it's dealt with. I think you alluded to who's going to make these decisions. Will it be the parish or the bishop? So I guess the two questions, how do people identify, and do you have any idea who makes the decisions? Or is there an idea to bring that decision making down to the parish or bigger metropolitan level?
This is the greatest challenge facing the state right now. Because all of the intrigue about the council is one thing, but the big issue is going to be what parishes decide to do. For example, more than one bishop, I think 4 bishops, both in Moscow Patriarchate and Kievan Patriarchate, have said to the media that they think between 70 to 80% of the parishes in Volyn are going to move over even if their bishop doesn't. I don't know what's going to happen immediately, but I don't know how you verify that the method is fair. How do you verify that if you're the state, especially when right now the Ukrainian Secret Service is doing investigations of priests and parishes and Metropolitan Paul and the Lavra and whatever one thinks of these people? It sure looks like a coercive action of the state. So really the state has guaranteed equal rights to those parishes that want to remain within the Moscow Patriarchate. How they're gonna go about so if a parish is 100% that they want to migrate over, one would hope that might be easy. But what happens if it's 70-30 or 60-40?
By the way, there are models in other places in the last 20, 30 years. We had the Greek Catholics and the Orthodox in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and they do this. They actually fight over churches, etc.
Right.
And the state intervenes in the end and says, okay, all of this is going back to the Greek Catholics, but now we're going to give money for the Orthodox to build new churches. So, I mean, there are ways of doing this. It's not unique here in Ukraine. And it's coming. Absolutely. That's what's going to happen.
And it will be about property. Because the
And
parishes
of course,
are
it's all about
registered.
property.
Legally, in Ukraine, parishes are registered, the other bodies aren't. And even in monasteries in Ukraine, the monastery is still actually owned by the state.
Right.
It's only,
Exactly.
so to speak, leased to the monastery. So it's going to be, it is going to be the state deciding, and it's going to be a mess.
But in the current climate of information war, I think that this is, I don't want it to be this way. I think that Christians want it to be peaceful. But I think that you're going to see a magnification of what happened in 1989 through the early 90s.
It also gets battled out in the U.S. now, and the courts have only been able to give it to the congregation by proving that the Orthodox Church is a non-hierarchical church.
Right.
By American law, which is one of the most bizarre,
Yeah.
I think, decisions
just
of the
firing
day.
the churches
But there are problems everywhere on it, yeah.
Well, let's return to your final comment about hope and a peaceful transition. But let me first thank the guests who are here. If you like seeing these talks and hearing more, consider supporting some of our institutions here. We've been having packed house the last couple of times, so please consider supporting us, that we can bring such wonderful speakers as Father Todd and obviously Nicholas Denysenko here. Allow me to thank both speakers, particularly Nicholas, for a wonderful presentation. You've enriched our conversation, and we move things forward. And hope they're listening to us in Ukraine right now on what we should do. And to help officially launch this book today, please join me in congratulating him on such a wonderful work. Thank you. Have a good evening.